we all still live in this nuclear age, and we're all still trying to figure out how do we live in a world where nuclear weapons exist.
Do you think you'll win a Nobel Prize? He's like, well, Nobel did invent dynamite.
Right.
To be fair, they're recognizing that by doing this, they are engaging in something that's going to, if it works, change the world.
Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew.
Hello. Hey, guys.
Today, we're going to be talking about a movie we all saw this weekend. Of course, the biggest movie of the year, biggest release of the year happened this weekend, and that was Barbie with $162 million. But instead, we're going to talk about Oppenheimer.
The one that matters.
Yes.
People are going to get on you for that one.
I know.
Yeah.
Hey, nothing against Barbie.
You're such a Ken. Okay. All right. Spoiler warning. If you want to watch the movie fresh without knowing the details of the movie, this is your chance to opt out of this podcast until after you've seen the movie. But then come back and listen to this podcast. So here's a question. As I walked into the theater, I had immediately a couple thoughts. Did y'all have any thoughts when you walked into the theater? Anything that you noticed before the movie started?
Well, I know in my case, I walked in about 3 minutes late. So sorry, guys.
How dare.
If you were in the theater. But it was rather full. I would say at least 3/4 full. It was a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, that's saying something.
It really is. So I had to sit more close to the front. So really quite a good turnout.
Yeah.
We saw Friday evening.
Friday.
So it's opening night. Yeah.
And it was also, of course, the release of Barbie. So I wasn't expecting the theater to be full, but it was very full. And even after the movie started, I noticed people walking in and going for those, individual seats that always remain open in kind of the nicer seating sections. And so that kind of got me thinking. I was like, why is this so full? It's kind of a dry historical biopic kind of movie. Sure, Christopher Nolan's a draw and it's a star-studded cast, but Barbie is colorful. You think Barbie would be getting all the crowds, but
well, to be fair, Barbie did get a little bit more.
That's true. That's
Barbenheimer.
Oh yeah. My conclusion though on why it was so full is we all still live in this nuclear age, and we're all still trying to figure out how do we live in a world where nuclear weapons exist. And so I think there's that interest for pretty much everybody. Sure. And I think that's a big part of the draw for us.
Personal connection of real life lived.
Right. And some of our elders went through those training sessions in school where they had to hide under the desks and stuff. Did you ever have to do that, Thomas? Are you that old?
No, I never did. I, as I'm thinking back, I don't think I noticed one person wearing a mask.
It's almost like we live in 2023.
Well, it's like kind of COVID is really starting to go back into the rearview mirror. You're just not seeing remnants of it anymore. And I mean, being in that crowded of a theater, it wasn't as surprising maybe to me that it was pretty crowded. Opening weekend, like you said, a Christopher Nolan movie. Also, who doesn't want to see a nuclear explosion?
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of is fascinating in itself.
That was one of the big pitches for the movie, was the depiction of the explosion itself.
Side note, that really doesn't matter, but it's annoying, and maybe it's because I haven't been to movies as often due to being a young father, but popcorn and a drink was $16.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And on that topic, I noticed...
It's inflation for you. Right?
I noticed the parking garage that I parked in before I went to go see the movie. Usually the theater will validate your ticket and then you don't have to pay for parking. I still had to pay $3 for parking after the validation. I was like...
Well, world we live in.
Yeah.
Talk about the film.
Yeah. All right. That's a hard segue for me. So what I kind of noticed about the movie is it's ambiguous on the topics it's discussing. So what I mean by that is it shows you kind of, as best it can, the factual events that happened and the relationships and all these different aspects of the film, but it doesn't tell you good or bad. They were right to do this, they were wrong to do that. It kind of leaves that up to you, and you have to choose for yourself, were they right to make the bomb? Were they right to use it? Even some things like what was Oppenheimer thinking in this scene is not quite clear.
In a way, it's almost like how journalism ought to be.
Yeah, almost. So that was just a interesting thing I noticed about it.
Yeah, and maybe that was kind of a refreshing in light of how we've gotten used to being kind of almost preached to in movies. And this was kind of interesting in that we know it's a historic movie. It's a historic piece and a telling of history. And he's obviously telling it in an artistic manner. So it wasn't just like a documentary. To his credit, you didn't feel like he was trying to form your opinion for you.
Yeah. You would kind of expect that after watching Oppenheimer, you would have Christopher Nolan's opinion on these events clear to you by the end of the movie. And it's not. It's not clear. Of course, there's certainly things he probably did that we don't notice, like he left things out that we just don't know about because he left them out. But
I will admit, when the movie first began and there was all the big Ivy League circles talking about communism and unions and all that stuff, I was bracing myself for this going to be turned into some kind of a left-leaning film about how communists were oppressed or something. It did not do that.
yeah, I noticed the same thing, and I was kind of bracing myself in the same way. And you're right. It avoids that pretty neatly.
It tackles communism in the sense of that was popular amongst academics at that time.
Right, in the factual historic way.
Yeah, in the factual historic way.
So just some outlines of the movie and just kind of some things you might want to know before you go into the theater. I didn't know going in that it was 3 hours long. That's the kind of thing you usually like to know before you go into the theater.
Yeah.
3 hours long. It also has something that's a little bit confusing, where there's kind of three main timelines in the movie that are all interwoven. Thomas, I think you...
Yeah, they're not interwoven. They're interwoven, but they're not parallel.
Yeah, and you compared it to another movie, right?
Yeah, Dunkirk, which Christopher Nolan directed. I very much enjoyed Dunkirk, but I know that there was a lot of criticism of it from some folks because of his way of kind of weaving three different storylines parallel all together, and not necessarily, at least initially at the beginning of that movie, people were probably confused as to what was happening because it wasn't quite linear like maybe people expect. Similarly, this movie does that kind of a jumping from different timelines.
Yeah.
In fact, it was my wife who saw it with me that irritated her very much, because if you don't know the story, it can be kind of difficult to follow where you are in the overall history.
Yeah, especially because, many of the same characters are in these different timelines. Obviously, Oppenheimer's in all of them. Surprise, surprise. But there's the other aspect, Thomas, that you noted about the black and white versus color.
Yeah, so there's an interweaving that you probably noticed it. You can't help but notice it, but I don't actually remember if it starts in black and white or color. I think it's color, but there's this interweaving of going from black and white to color to black and white to color.
And like the expectation is black and white means past. Color means current.
And that's not what it means.
Right.
And so that can be confusing too, because generally in the past or in other movies, that might be a cue to the past. And now when we're in color, we're more in the present. That's not how it was being used in this, and that could throw you as well.
It's a movie that has to be examined.
Yeah, that's true. You're not going to walk out of this movie knowing exactly what it meant in all these scenes, exactly all the themes that were explored. You'd have to watch it more than once to get all that.
It prompts thought, which I appreciate about movies. It's not just go to and waste 3 hours of your Saturday afternoon on.
Right. I guess we'll get to your theory on the black and white later when it's a little bit more appropriate.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think we're going to sort of outline the film.
Yeah. So the three timelines, I'll kind of name them. The first one is Oppenheimer as a young man, and that kind of follows all the way through the Manhattan Project. And that timeline is more or less linear from young man to adulthood. And then there's the timeline that's the security hearing Oppenheimer's going through in like 53, something
I think
like that.
1953. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's basically him outlining his entire life for these very intrusive inquisitors, and they come off as inquisitors with all the connotations that implies. And then the third one is this other character named Strauss and his Senate confirmation hearing for a cabinet seat, I believe.
Yeah, an Eisenhower administration.
Yeah.
I think it's a nuclear energy or atomic energy position, isn't it?
No, so he was on the Atomic Energy Commission But then the hearing is for him being in a cabinet seat in the administration, so secretary of something.
Gotcha.
I can't remember exactly which position he's up for, but defense or something like that, because he was a rear admiral, I think, that character.
Sure.
So that's kind of the outline of the movie. It more or less follows Oppenheimer's life, but it's not entirely clear that Oppenheimer is the focus the whole time. There's kind of different things that are focused on at different parts of the movie.
Yeah, there's obviously the question of the bomb. There's the question of science and scientists,
Right.
and their role as, I guess, practitioners of science, and then being thrust into the role of policymaker,
Right.
and morality, making decisions based on the implications of their work rather than their work.
That's actually an excellent segue to the next section, which is just I was struck while I was watching the movie. You have the beginning of the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer getting kind of tapped as the leader, and his efforts to basically collect all the greatest American scientists he could. And I was struck by the unified nature of the country in this effort to build the bomb, and specifically in the movie it's depicted as build the bomb before the Nazis. Of course, if you know the real factual history, you'll know that the Nazis pretty much gave up on making the bomb, and they were never really anywhere close. But at the time, in the U.S., we did fear. Yeah,
That was fear. Reason not to believe that they were doing it.
Exactly.
And the movie makes it clear that that's what motivated Oppenheimer to be a part of the project.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Right.
I mean, his Jewish heritage and his knowledge that what Hitler was doing to the Jews, and he especially saw this as something he needed to be a part of.
Yeah.
They make that clear, and I don't think that contradicts history.
No. I mean, I'm obviously, we don't know Oppenheimer personally, any of us, but I imagine that would have had to have been involved in his thinking. Yeah. There's also, as you were talking about, the kind of the hubris the scientists exhibit, where thinking they both have the power and they should make this weapon that Oppenheimer says a couple times, like it's going to end this war. And then later on, he says maybe end all wars. And it's essentially they're playing God, thinking they can improve the human race en masse.
Yeah, to be fair, they're recognizing that by doing this, they are engaging in something that's going to, if it works, change the world.
And it did. That's
And
true. Yeah.
And so did they appreciate just how much it would? That's up for debate.
Yeah. I mean, anyone trying to predict the history of nuclear weapons after Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not gonna do very well on their predictions, I don't think.
Well, I was struck with how similar it is to what we see today with the whole trust the science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I really think that it speaks to this. Genius does not equal wisdom.
Right. There's reason and there's intelligence and there's wisdom, and those are separate things. And yeah, this is kind of a depiction of reason untethered by wisdom, perhaps. I mean, there's definitely attempts at wisdom by the scientists.
Most definitely. I think they all wanted to do the right thing.
Right. And you see their struggle and their questioning of, are we doing the right thing? How should we go about this? Should a weapon like this even exist? But of course, in the end, they do create the atomic bomb. There's a interesting line kind of on this topic right at the beginning of the Los Alamos section of the Manhattan Project, when all the scientists are arriving. You see Oppenheimer, and before that point, he's always been in lab coats and looking like a scientist, or at a party dressed like a normal civilian. But in this scene, he's suddenly in a military uniform, and it's kind of out of place. And you're like, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. He's leading a U.S. military project. But one of his buddies says, take off that uniform. You're a scientist. Put on a lab coat. They need you because you're a scientist. You're not a general.
That was a symbolic scene of his struggle between the establishment of power in the world and the establishment of science and his craft.
Yeah.
And he was pulled between two worlds.
Right. And the power in the world, political nature of his life is explored deeply in the second half of the movie, I guess.
But that really kind of signals, okay, I have this pull on my life between two powers.
Yeah.
How do y'all think of Nolan's depicting of kind of the scientist, the academic in the movie, specifically Oppenheimer, obviously? Was there anything in his depiction of Oppenheimer that was interesting or unique, you think?
I noticed just kind of a common trope that you see in all sorts of things. And the example of another place you've seen it is I can't remember the name of the movie, but it's the biopic about Stephen Hawking, where it seems like when we're in a movie depicting a young genius in college, inevitably they're going to be skinny. That makes sense. People in college are usually skinny because they're young. But they must have the wild hair. It's very important to have wild hair when you're a young genius scientist. And they do that with Oppenheimer in this as well. It's partially to make him look young because they use the same actor for all parts of his life. But it's also that's just a funny trope, I think, because of Einstein, that we associate wild hair with genius.
I thought it was interesting the way they would juxtapose like the stars of the universe, which are obviously massive nuclear events, explosions. And then they would show the sparks kind of like flying everywhere.
Right. So that's kind of the fourth part of the movie.
Yeah.
That was these, I guess they're imaginings of Oppenheimer. Where
he's kind of, I think he was trying to depict almost how Oppenheimer would think/feel.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It's not quite clear.
Yeah.
But it's a black background with sparks flying across or explosions. There's a few different kind of versions of it throughout the movie.
Theoretical physicist. Yeah. So it's like his imagination.
Right.
And I don't know if it's symbolic of his imagination meeting reality.
Yeah. I did wonder during those, while the movie was going, if that was supposed to be the actual nuclear reaction happening in the bomb in the moments before the major explosion, if that's what it was supposed to represent.
Maybe it started in his mind.
Yeah.
And then moved into reality.
It's an interesting thought.
Just a wonder, really.
Yeah.
So moving on, I have a question. I noticed while we were watching the movie, I recognized a lot of these names. Early in the movie, Oppenheimer says he has to make it to some lecture because it's Niels Bohr. And he says it like you're supposed to know who it is. And I did remember the name. I didn't quite remember all the details of who Niels Bohr was, but I knew he was a famous scientist. Did y'all pick up on that? Did y'all remember all those names that are dropped throughout the movie?
The only one I remembered was Heisenberg.
Heisenberg, yeah, okay.
And it's because of Breaking Bad.
I will admit that it is because of Breaking Bad.
That was for me too. I don't even know.
Heisenberg is not
the only other that I recognized was Einstein.
Okay.
Anyways, beyond that,
that's kind of a gimme.
Yeah, I was clueless.
Right.
Other than Einstein, Heisenberg.
Right. Well, I just thought it was interesting because there's kind of an Easter egg nature to, if you do remember even just the names of these scientists, there's kind of an Easter egg nature to it as you're watching the movie because they slowly pop up one by one, all these scientists that you may or may not know the names of, like Feynman and Fermi and Heisenberg and Niels Bohr, and there were a couple others I recognized as well. But that kind of leads me to the question, why don't we know this history better? We know World War II history quite well, but the actual development of the bomb, arguably the most important event of the 20th century, we don't know it that well. When I was watching the movie, I was like, I wonder if this is accurate or not. And I didn't know.
I felt like going and grabbing a history book after I left.
Yeah. Well, I think we all had that reaction. Part of it, I'm wondering, is because it was top secret. The Manhattan Project. And so these guys would be known later, and Oppenheimer was known before it, but how much of the U.S. government's concern for protecting this, and that's depicted in the film where there's, the Soviets pretty quickly get the bomb and they realize that there were actually spies involved, even in the Manhattan Project. That's probably part of the reason they got the bomb so fast.
And the general who's heading up the Manhattan Project makes some jokes as well. At one point he says, oh, don't worry, we'll just kill him, about someone who knows something who shouldn't. And I'm joking. So but it's also like, was he joking? It's not clear.
So my thought was anyone who's involved in some type of top secret weapons project, even after the weapon has been revealed, there's still going to be a lot of secrecy surrounding how that was developed. And so maybe that's part of an explanation for why we don't know these guys.
Right. Like I was just seeing something about, or was it one of you two telling me about a tertiary connection to me of someone who had actually been through Oak Ridge and couldn't really talk about it. Because even today, Oak Ridge is still quite secret. And if you're not familiar, Oak Ridge was one of the parts of the Manhattan Project that helped develop the bomb. It's where they were enriching the uranium, I believe.
Here in the great state of Tennessee.
Absolutely.
So I think that might be part of the explanation for why we don't know about a lot of these different scientists. But to be fair, if you're in a certain field, or like if you're a physicist or something like this, you probably do know these guys.
Yeah, I'm certain you do.
And Oppenheimer was on the cover of Time magazine.
Right.
Yeah.
Twice, I believe. And on that note, I did check out the Time magazine cover because I was just curious, how well did they make Cillian Murphy, who plays Oppenheimer in the movie, look like the actual person? And I think they did a pretty good job. He does. You and I were watching an interview with Oppenheimer from 1965, and you can definitely see why they chose Cillian Murphy to play him.
Yeah.
The only thing about the Time cover is in the movie, they make Cillian Murphy look especially skeletal for the Time cover. And I don't think that's quite there in the actual real Time cover.
One thing about the historical attributes and the Time cover being one of them, a different one that's interesting is the final scene. Well, it's not the final scene. The scene after they've dropped the bomb. Yeah, the finality of the project. Everyone in attendance to the speech, to Oppenheimer's speech. Yeah, they have flags.
Oh yeah, the
American flags.
Yeah,
and they're all 50-star flags, which at that time there were not 50 states.
Right, there was 48.
Yeah. So little error there.
So I guess the nuclear explosion.
Were you looking for that?
Involved some time travel.
Not exactly. It just I had read about.
I mean,
I just saw an article about that.
Oh, really?
So I guess the nuclear explosion just blew some little flags back 12 years, 11 years. No, wait.
Time travel.
20 years, something like that. Because it was 61 when we gained Alaska and Hawaii, right?
Yes.
Or 59?
Hawaii was 59.
Okay, they were both 59. Yeah. So that's just, no, there weren't 50 states, in case you're watching the movie and you happen to count all the stars on the flag. Okay, so I noticed there's a lot of, as I said earlier, ambiguity to the movie, but there's also symbology and themes that you're meant to pick up on them. Sometimes you hear about English teachers saying the curtain was blue because the author is talking about depression, and then you hear the author saying, no, it was just a blue curtain. In this movie, the symbology is there on purpose for certain. And there were a few things we noticed on that.
Maybe start with the most striking one, and that was the unexpected and very graphic nudity.
Right. That was something I wasn't expecting. I did see that the movie was rated R going into the theater.
But it was Nolan, and from my memory, I don't recall Christopher Nolan really using that in much of or any of his films that I'm aware of.
Agreed. I had that same thought, and I was working through his previous filmography that I've seen, and I couldn't think of any.
I think I was reading this is the first movie he's actually had that in.
Yeah.
And he gave an explanation saying it was essential to the plot, he thought, and that's why he put it in there.
Yeah, I can actually read the quote if I still have it pulled up here. Yeah, so this is Nolan defending essentially the nudity in the movie. When you look at Oppenheimer's life and you look at his story, that aspect of his life, the aspect of his sexuality, his way with women, the charm that he exuded, apparently, it's an essential part of his story. It felt very important to understand their relationship and really see inside it and understand what made it tick without being coy or elusive about it. But to try to be intimate, to try to be in there with him and fully understand the relationship that was so important to him. So that's Nolan's reasoning for including the nudity.
I did appreciate that there was great effort taken, particularly in this area, to expose the reality of Oppenheimer's character.
Mm-hmm. It's an exposing scene for both characters there, yeah. And
it is revealed, that he is in many ways a womanizer. He's not much of a family man. And he's not a perfect guy. And so it's sort of like this conflict of his character and a compromise of his character. And I also think in some ways it shows an internal struggle that he has between doing what he wants and doing what he must.
Yeah, and that's kind of a struggle throughout the movie. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the nudity in the affair is used to kind of illustrate that,
and it kicks it off too.
That's true, but overall, I still got to come down on the side of do we really need to have nudity in our movies? Is it necessary? I kind of feel like no, it's not. But I will say, at least the scenes they're not particularly lascivious. It's not depicted in a necessarily sexy way most of the time, but I felt it was gratuitous nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm still struggling to understand, based on that quote, how it was essential to show his kind of character. I think there were a couple scenes that that wasn't even actually the focus necessarily, especially the one I'm thinking of, the one in the security hearing. But that was very symbolic. Yeah,
right.
Obviously, that one was. Yeah,
it's to illustrate
that was
how bare he is being before these inquisitors and fully exposing every part of him. And his wife basically says that, why are you exposing every part of our life to these people?
Yeah, it's not just his life; it's hers as well.
Exactly.
So I struggle to understand. Well, I don't necessarily, like you were saying, agree with Nolan on his logic there. I don't think he needed to do that in order to get across the same idea of the character that he was.
Especially because Hollywood's so good at implying nudity without actually showing it. They can do it. You're just fine.
You can imply it. You don't have to show it necessarily. I guess there's the shock value, and maybe that's what he was thinking. If you think about it, the bomb is supposed to also be a very shocking event.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was that was an element juxtaposing those kind of things.
That was kind of my thought at the moment when the first nude scene came up. I was thinking, well, he's talking about nuclear weapons and actually using these on populated areas. So maybe he just felt it would be bad taste to do that and then be coy about nudity. I disagree, but I think that may be what he was going for.
I would say along those lines, I think he was almost a little coy with when he was depicting the bomb explosion. Because I have seen most of us have probably seen either actual footage or movies that depict nuclear explosions.
Right.
And I was kind of expecting, okay, obviously the bomb is half the reason you go to this movie. People are thinking, okay, we're going to learn about how the bomb was made. Yay. And when it goes off, I know that you leaned over to me before it was going to go off, and you're saying this is the biggest cinematic
one of the largest
actual captured explosions on film,
right,
or something
for a movie. So let me try to say that in a more clear way.
Yeah,
it's one of the largest explosions that were made and filmed for a movie. I had a better way of saying it in the theater, but I can't remember what it was.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, they show it. It's not like they hide it.
This is the Trinity project.
When the Trinity goes off.
So it's the first test.
Last bomb. And that I thought was fascinating. And they show the explosion. And it's not your stereotypical mushroom cloud with everything. It just looks like it looks like a big explosion. But beyond that, it's not how we have come to be familiar with nuclear bombs.
It's not kind of doing what, like a Marvel movie might do and kind of showing an explosion in a glorious nature where it's like, whoa,
right,
shock and awe kind of thing. It doesn't really do that. There is shock and there is awe, but it's much more character focused even while the explosion's going on.
Right. And then the time frame that they spent a lot of time as the explosion's going on, panning all the different scientists and everyone involved in the project who's watching at a distance.
And you see them smeared with some visible sunscreen.
Stuff like that, or behind glass and everything.
Yeah.
And the amount of time that happens between the explosion happening and then...
Well, it leads you to wonder because you watch the explosion, but you don't hear it because they're far away, as you want to be if you're watching a nuclear explosion.
And why he drew that out, because I'm sure he drew that. I don't think it was
right. It's
got
to be 30 seconds.
I know.
Between watching the explosion and then the shock wave arriving with
the sound wave and everything. Yeah.
And it does make you wonder, is he just doing it silent?
Right.
Is it an artistic choice to not include the sound? But then, of course, the shockwave does eventually show up. So,
but the depiction of the explosion, for like you said, for being such a big budget explosion, there's a surprising lack of actual footage of it in the movie.
Right. It's kind of one and done.
Yeah. And that was a little bit interesting to me. And then it's never, as far as I recall, it's never even, no images of it are shown again after that.
It's just the one.
Really, again, to the character focused item, and this segues, I think, on the implications of the bomb rather than the might and power of the bomb. After the announcement for the bombs being dropped, or the first bomb being dropped.
You mean on Hiroshima?
Yeah, he has this vision when he's going to do his speech to everyone
who's worked on the project.
Yeah, all the team, a huge amount of staff that's in literally a small town that he's had built for this project. And they're all cheering, etc. And the scene depicts them cheering, but then also flashes to like their skin melting off.
Right, kind of a Terminator Judgment Day kind of scene.
Yeah, and it's like, I guess he's realizing what have they done and the impact on their lives, the impact on everyone's lives for all of humanity.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of bringing home the world has changed and this is a risk for everyone all over the world from now on.
Yes.
One of the things that I just kind of thought about is, so Oppenheimer is, I wouldn't say gung-ho, but he's fully on board building the bomb when they're still at war with Germany because his fear is the Nazis will get it and you have to get it before the Nazis do.
Right. And it's made it absolutely explicit that it's about the fact that he's a Jew and the Nazis are rounding up Jews.
Right. After Germany surrenders, they're still working on the Manhattan Project, and there's a scene where he's kind of like, pretty much, we don't have to go forward anymore. We're done. And,
Matt Damon's character.
Matt Damon's, he's like, no, we're still going. We're still at war with Japan.
Yeah.
And so, they continue and they finish the project and the bombs.
Well, after the general convinces him we have to go on, then there's a scene where all his team, all the scientists working under him, are debating for themselves. Do we finish this? Is it right for us to finish this now that Germany's been defeated? And he comes in and he basically convinces them we have to do this. And also we're just making it, it's someone else who's going to drop it. And so blood is going to be on their hands, not ours. And so he makes that argument to them. And it's kind of made clear that I felt, and it is up to interpretation, but I felt that he's kind of saying something even he doesn't quite believe in that scene.
Yeah.
Well, there was, I kind of what I was getting at is he wanted this limiting factor that, we'll build this one bomb, this atomic bomb. And early on, there's already, I can't remember the scientist, but he's pushing for beyond it to go with the H bomb.
Yeah.
And he said we can't stop here at the atom bomb here. We need to keep going. And Oppenheimer was very resistant to that. It's almost like it
was Edward Teller is the scientist.
He wanted to prevent it from developing beyond a certain point, almost artificially. And like you said, Teller was like saying, no, we need to keep going with this. It was a fascinating
kind of in the movie has this idea that you can make the largest, most destructive bomb ever made, and people will try to add +1 to that.
To that point, there's a moment where he is struggling. He's been told, okay, we have to go on with this, and he's having an internal struggle. And he's like, how do I reckon with this? And then how do I convince the team? And one of his good friends from New York says to him, you can either take the position of a peer or a prophet. But if you take the position of a prophet, prophets can never be robbed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he took the position of the prophet, and he says, this will end all wars.
Right.
That was his prophecy.
Of course, it's not quite right, but looking at what has occurred since then, it has been some of the most peaceful times humanity has encountered, at least in parts of the world.
There hasn't been a conflict of that size since.
Right, exactly.
But a big fear that we've all grown up under is World War III, which would be almost everyone agrees would probably be nuclear.
Right. It just seems, that's the source of, it's an Einstein quote, right? I know not what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah.
So the metaphors in the movie, though, there's a couple others, and they kind of relate to the bomb. So at the beginning of this movie, there's a scene where Oppenheimer, as a young man, is kind of being bullied by his teacher in college or university, I guess. And this one other student is sucking up and puts an apple on the teacher's desk. And then everyone goes to the lecture for Niels Bohr that Oppenheimer wanted to be at. And they're making him stay behind, kind of Cinderella moment, no, you can't go to the party, you got to clean up. And so he's in a chemical lab and he's putting stuff up, and one of the bottles is a bottle of cyanide. And you kind of see this moment of anger and just not thought out action where he gets a syringe of cyanide and injects it into this apple that's on the teacher's desk. And it's kind of left there. And you just assume, oh, he just killed his teacher. And it's not until like 15 minutes later that it goes back to that time frame, and you see him that night waking up super duper early in the morning and racing to try to get the apple before the teacher takes a bite, and changing his mind. And it's kind of a metaphor for what he did with the bomb.
Foreshadowing. Yeah.
Right, foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Where he because in the movie it is clear after World War II is over, there's a lot of scenes of him working hard to kind of denuclearize the world, and he's like changing his mind. And that's a big question actually in the movie. When did your mind change? And
actions for the United Nations and world government and regulation.
Well, someone else says that means world government when he's saying we need to do this. So, and he's like, well, it's better than nuclear winter. I guess it's his idea. There's also, just touching on this, I know you don't quite agree with this, but I was struck in the movie that the marriage between Oppenheimer and his wife, who's played by Emily Blunt, is kind of refreshingly not jaded, real, where they have these struggles. They both have absolutely huge flaws in their marriage even, and as parents. But despite that, they do fight for one another. They do stick together. They do care about one another. And they, even when it may have been easier to quit, they don't quit. They don't divorce. And they're married up until the end of their lives, as far as the movie shows.
I think that in some ways it's like marriage is not this idyllic happiness, but it is steadfast choices for we're better together than apart.
Right. And that brings me to a quote that we had kind of wanted to say, which was, it kind of leads to this question, and this question is examined throughout the movie of, is it better to quit or is it better to keep going? And it applies to the marriage, it applies to the bomb, it applies to even later his kind of political life, it applies to all these different things. And he seemingly makes the choice to keep going with all of them.
Yeah, he is certainly not a quitting man.
No.
I do think it's not a movie with a happy ending, and maybe that's the real life aspect of it, in the sense of
it's not a sad ending either. It's kind of just this is how his life ended.
Yeah, but I feel like his happiness, if he could have imagined it, would have been a scientist discovering more and more about the world.
Right. I mean,
and just
I think
discovery
it would have been him as an astronomer, because like the movie does talk on how he was one of the leading minds in understanding black holes in that time frame. And so like, yeah, his ideal life would be he stays with the woman he had an affair with, right? Probably. He gets to live in New Mexico, which he talks about him loving New Mexico and astronomy, essentially. But instead, he became the father of nuclear weapons.
And even further, he is involved in what he wants, which he is ultimately the good of humanity, in his opinion, although maybe flawed in some ways, particularly in the political sense, since he did have, communist ideology.
Right. He's got some communist leanings
Earlier in his life.
And it's specifically related to the parts he talks about in the movie are about preventing the rise of fascism in Spain. And that's where he's supporting communists who are fighting against fascists in Spain.
But there's a really striking quote that occurs during the hearing and his decision to bring his wife in to testify.
Because this is after he's given the testimony about the affair, and there's been the scene that really sells how exposed he's been, and it's just been absolutely brutal on him from these inquisitors.
And his lawyer asks him, do you think that's a good idea? Will she fold under pressure, etc.?
And even he questions whether she'll show up.
Yeah. And his response is, we have walked through the fire together.
And he says she'll do fine.
She'll do fine. And that is so symbolic of marriage and the crucible of marriage and how it binds people together and that decision to stay with one another through that forging experience, but then also the forging of this power that he created and the bomb ultimately and the technology that he created.
Yeah. And then when she does show up and she does testify, she cleans their clocks.
Yeah.
She just gets the better of them at every turn.
Satisfying.
Yeah. Okay. So now we come to kind of the question of the movie, which is the bomb itself. Should it have been built? Should it have been used? Should they have told the Russians they were going to use it? Because that's a question Oppenheimer raises many times because he's like, the Russians are our ally in World War II. We should tell them so they don't nuclear proliferate, essentially. And so what do y'all think? First question, should the bomb have been built?
I think it was inevitable.
Once the technology got to the point where it was possible. Yeah.
It was going to be built no matter what. So, yes.
Yeah, I'm glad it was us who built it and not the Nazis or the Russians.
Certainly.
Right.
No, I agree with much of the historians' kind of view, and many people at the time, that the bomb actually saved lives
In Japan.
in Japan, both U.S. lives and Japanese lives.
Right. And I think the interview we were watching with Oppenheimer, he says that, and he essentially says, and he's very careful in the interview. It's interesting because it does show that the movie does quite a bit of justice to the way he handled himself after the war. But he says it was the best option that was available. It wasn't a good option, but there weren't better ones. And knowing what we knew then, I don't know what else.
I mean, the terrible nature of it, but this was not just unique to the bomb, but the amount of civilians that died in the war because of the bombings of cities and other things like that, the indiscriminate nature of World War II in a lot of ways. And so that is that's one of those things that weighs heavy on no matter what you're doing when you're fighting in that war.
And there's the aspect, I think they touch on this in the movie, maybe I've just gotten it from other things recently, but the Japanese philosophy in that war was, it's better to die fighting than to surrender, ever.
Yeah.
And that's what the island hopping campaign in the Pacific showed, that they believed that and they were willing to do it.
Yeah.
And so the idea is, essentially, we would kill all the Japanese.
Yeah, how do you change a culture that is so steeped in that ideology?
Yeah, and
you have to shock them out of it, which is effectively, I think, what
use a little bit of meme language. You have to drop the sun on them twice.
Yes, which we did.
I mean, it worked. It definitely did. But I can understand why people ask the question, and it's not wrong to ask the question.
And just on that, the movie does provide the, I think, correct explanation of why it was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is we're going to drop it once to prove that we can do it, and then we're going to drop it twice to prove that we can keep doing it.
There actually is a lot of debate on that aspect, too. They don't go into that in the movie, though, but in real life, I think there's people that try to debate that and say, well, they could have waited longer, or maybe Japan was getting ready to surrender anyway after the first one.
Right. But that's the what if. We can't know what would have happened. We know what did happen. Lots of people died, but there were actually worse bombings than Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II even.
The fire bombings
were
horrifying.
Right. And more people died.
Well, to be fair to Oppenheimer, if you're most known for helping build and helping us move into the atomic age by building the most destructive weapon the world has ever known, your name is associated with destruction, effectively. And I could see why, even as a scientist who would be more motivated to want to build something, but you're building something that destroys. That's his sole purpose, is to destroy.
I will say this. He mentions in the movie, though, that he was asked, do you think you'll win a Nobel Prize? He's like, well, Nobel did invent dynamite.
Right. Right. That's true, Alfred. Nobel did invent dynamite, or TNT, I think.
Yeah, it was TNT.
Which to most people, and to me, even those are the same thing, but apparently there's some important distinction there. I've never quite understood it.
So for that question, I think all of us probably have heard that question, maybe asked that question or argued that question well before seeing Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
And like you said, Oppenheimer doesn't try to answer it necessarily.
Well, there are many answers presented by
characters, but I feel like I don't think that Nolan was trying to answer the question one or another. I think in that aspect, he was just trying to say, this is where it was. This is what people were saying. I'm going to leave it at that. The last line that he presents, if I recall, is the comment that Einstein makes to Oppenheimer. Supposedly, this is all probably apocryphal, right?
Well, yeah, we know Oppenheimer and Einstein did meet and they did know one another, but I don't know that we have transcripts of their conversations. Yeah.
And that was, what was his message? What was Einstein's message?
It was, I can't remember the exact quote, but it is basically, they're going to one day celebrate you for this, but it's not going to be for you. It's going to be for them. Which in the movie, it kind of makes sense. I never quite fully understood what he meant there, but I think maybe if I watched it again, I would.
Yeah.
Like we said, it's a movie that requires
a lot. There's a lot there in this movie.
I will just say on whether we should have used the bomb or not, that I was told, and this has framed my entire view of the matter my whole life, I was told by my World War II vet grandfather, who was in the European front, that it was the right thing to do and that we would have lost hundreds of thousands of our boys if we'd had to go in, and maybe even him. He was in Germany, but if enough people had died trying to storm Japan, he may have been called over there. You never know. So my whole life I've had the attitude because of that, because my grandfather told me that yes, it was the right thing to do.
Well, also there's one point that we didn't touch on, and that is the point of just because you can, should you? And that and that is more not related so much to using it, but to the building of it at all.
Right. And that kind of relates to kind of some more modern ideas as well.
Particularly artificial intelligence.
Right. So it's this idea, and this idea is very clear in the movie. And it's kind of the question that Oppenheimer non-verbally asks himself the whole time is, can you put the genie back in the bottle or the toothpaste back in the tube? And no. We might. We wish we could. It would be great if we could on some of these things, but no. Once the genie's out of the bottle, game over. You have to just live with the new reality. And like you said, AI.
As a good friend of ours said recently, nerds have gotten us in plenty of trouble.
Right. I was explaining AI. I was explaining AI to him, and he was asking me, why are they doing this? And I was like, I think it's just a bunch of nerds seeing what they can do and excited about it. He's like, well, that's caused plenty of trouble before. And yes, it certainly has.
But it will all, and to my earlier point though, it's inevitable. These things will always happen.
Well, I mean, it might be possible to keep the genie in the bottle on some things, but once the genie's out of the bottle, then it is inevitable. And
how do you answer that question? In other words, how do you answer the question of whether or not you should move forward into developing a new technology or something? Where is your moral foundation to make that call?
I think for a lot of these, for AI particularly, I think the analogy with the bomb is a good one.
Mm-hmm. We do it or they do it.
But the difference with AI, you could say, AI is not necessarily obviously a destructive mechanism in the same sense that what you're building. When you're building a bomb, you're building it to destroy.
Right. But I mean, it's worth noting the technology used to build the bomb is also what allows us to use nuclear power. And I am fully in support of nuclear power. Let's get on nuclear power already. That's a soapbox of mine.
A bit of a tangent there, but I thought it was interesting.
No, I don't. I think that was something worth talking about. Yeah. And it applies to social media. It applies to the internet. It applies to birth control. It applies to all sorts of stuff.
Well, we've just gone through potentially the results of scientists meddling in ways that led to millions of deaths.
Right.
With the COVID pandemic.
Right. Because, and I think you were saying if, and I kind of gave you some guff for saying
I'm still on the if. I'm not
if
sure.
COVID was developed in a lab, then it was the result of human hubris and gain of function research on diseases to try to make them more deadly. Well,
that wasn't the motivation behind it. Was not to make them more deadly, to try to then make
better vaccine.
Right. was the idea.
Right. We're gonna build a better gun so we can then make a better bulletproof vest.
That may be another glimpse into why the theaters were full. Because all of these questions
they're still unsettled.
They're unsettled. They affect our lives. They affect our concerns and futures, right?
So ultimately, it's a moral conundrum question. I think a lot of people are saying, well, what is, morally speaking, how do we answer this? And the movie doesn't answer it.
Right. And yeah, the big question of the movie, and even the big question of our century, is what do we do in the age of nuclear weapons? How do we do this? And lots of times the answer is you keep waking up in the morning and eating breakfast.
And that's same for AI too.
And it's same for AI, but it's also, you do have these large movements. No nukes, y'all. Get rid of all the nukes. It's like, it's not going to happen. It's, as long as people are capable of building new ones, it doesn't really matter if you get rid of them. Maybe we can go from having tens of thousands of them to just a couple thousand. That might be good. But you're never going to get back to zero nukes, I don't think, unless we bomb ourselves back to the Stone Age first.
Let's hope that doesn't happen in our lifetimes or ever.
All right. Wrapping up. So, Andrew, rating out of 10, what do you give the movie? What do you give Oppenheimer?
It's a solid 9.
Solid 9.
Yeah, it was a fantastic movie.
It was a very, very well made movie.
We call it, if it weren't for the nudity, I would say it might be a magnum opus for Christopher Nolan.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree. Thomas?
I'm not as high in it as you are. Okay. I would put maybe it as 7. I thought it was a little bit long. The acting is superb. Nolan has a certain style in the way he does his movies, which can be kind of jarring to some folks. I really like Dunkirk. In fact, I like Dunkirk better than this one.
I like Dunkirk too.
I think this one was a headier movie than Dunkirk was.
Definitely.
More intellectual for you.
Yeah, and so there's an element of you really are having to, it presses you to think, to ask questions. Like you said, everyone finishes a movie and says, I got to grab a history book.
Which is a good
Which is a good
Yep.
thing. So, and it's well done and it's interesting enough, but there's a pretty strong element of confusion. Maybe that's purposeful. Maybe that's what he's trying to communicate in his art form there. Like I said, I think I give it a 7. I didn't think it needed the nudity.
You don't?
Think it needed the nudity. I don't accept his explanation for that. One thing I would point out, this is not a movie that has any kind of woke messaging, which was
Right.
refreshing.
So refreshing.
There's, like we said, the communist thing we thought maybe, and then they just didn't do it. They avoided it.
No, and that was historical. He kept to the reality that was popular amongst many academia at the time. And so that's just telling the story.
Right.
And he did a good job of, I would give him kudos for just telling the story, not necessarily, I mean, there's obviously themes there. We've just talked about the question, but there isn't a woke theme. You don't feel like he's pushing an agenda of a 2023 agenda on.
Right. It doesn't have
audience.
that element that I think encapsulates what we mean when we say a movie is woke, where the movie is telling you, we're better than you. You need to believe what we believe, and here's why. And it doesn't have that.
Well, it doesn't have the whole intersectionality dynamic,
Right.
or I mean, it deals with, you could say it deals with issues of feminism and stuff, but that was also of an era in especially within academia, in when they're showing the dynamic with his wife and whatnot. So I would say on that point that was very refreshing.
Yeah, I agreed on that. So you said a 7?
A 7 out of 10, I'd give it.
I'll go between you two. I'll say an 8, which is where I was thinking even before you said 7. Okay, to be clear. Yeah, I do like the movie. I think it's a very good movie. Recommend go watch it. Maybe if you can wait until you can fast forward past the nude scenes, do that. That's the only big thing against it is the nudity. I was disappointed. Obviously, it's not that we're not attracted to women. It's just we don't want nudity in our movies there. But I will say it leaves you not in a happy mood. And I like to leave a movie happy. I like my movies, to be a little bit shorter unless they're Lord of the Rings.
So
yeah, an 8 out of 10 for me.
And so let's bring it around to the final question, which we opened this and titled this podcast.
Well, that's what we titled it. We haven't actually asked the question yet.
So let's ask the question.
Yes. So, Thomas?
Is Oppenheimer a hero?
I'm going to say he behaves heroically sometimes. I wouldn't say he's a hero. He has some heroic action.
I would say that's true of every hero, though. If you're doing a legitimate look into a real person, yes, there's going to be moments they're heroic and moments they're not. we're overall looking at, in this instance, what he decided, his biggest thing he did in his life, you could say.
Yeah.
Maybe we should ask it this way. Do we as a country view Oppenheimer as a hero?
Yeah. If you're asking, is Oppenheimer an American hero? Yes, unequivocally.
He is an American hero. It is a difficult thing given the, in some ways, departure from his life calling. That is, and I'll qualify this, he struggles with benevolence versus what he ultimately does in the studying of science for the purpose of benevolence and the furthering of humanity.
And just theory, because he's a theoretical physicist up until the Manhattan Project.
That's right. Now, the result, I think we all agree that the result saved lives.
Right.
Yeah. And so it was a net result of benevolence.
Yeah.
But he had no way of knowing that. And some ways it was just stepping forward because of pressure.
I will say, in his defense of his leader, his a heroic nature, he is a leader of the scientists he gathers kind of for the project. He leads them. He's not wishy-washy. He's not a bad leader. He's a good leader. He knows where we need to go, and he helps them get there, and he helps them deal with interpersonal dynamics. And those are heroic qualities.
Certainly.
I do think it's interesting that, and this is my impression, I'm going to be completely wrong on this, but it seems like of scientific heroes, American scientific heroes, I would put Einstein above him.
Right.
I would maybe even put von Braun, ironically, above him, and which is crazy if you think about their histories. And I think it has everything to do with the fact, not everything, a lot to do with the fact that as much as we recognize what the bomb did in saving Americans' lives and ending the war, it's still such a terrible weapon that this makes it hard to...
It's hard to lionize someone who made something so, as you said, terrible. And I think that's the right word. It doesn't mean it's bad at being a weapon. It is a weapon that is terror. In the truest sense, it not of terror, I wouldn't say.
Well, creates...
I mean, you should feel terror at being nuked, but it's terrible in the sense of awe. Right. It's terrible in the what has God wrought kind of way.
Well, it's terrible and
have become death, destroyer of worlds,
right?
Which is terrible. I mean, what it results is in death, destruction. Terrible.
In such an instant, final, total way. Yeah.
And I say that maybe that's part of it. The other part of it may be, and I don't know this, but Oppenheimer is also kind of at least portrayed in I think it might be accurate. He was kind of an awkward guy. A lot of scientists are.
Yeah.
But he seems like almost...
You said awkward the other day, and I know what you mean. I think a better term is off. He's not awkward because he's charming when he wants to be, and he can schmooze, and he's a ladies' man. Yeah. So he's not awkward in that sense. It's not like he stumbles over his words, but he's awkward in the sense that he's just kind of removed from the norm of humanity.
Okay. That's maybe, there's probably a better word for it. He's not a warm person.
No.
I think he is an American hero. I think that he is a man who's struggled greatly with his own self, and we all struggle. I don't think that he ultimately acted with malice.
No, I don't think you could say that at all.
I would say he's a hero.
Yeah, agreed. All right, as we wrap up, you've got 5 seconds each. How do we live in a world with nuclear weapons? What's the answer? Go, Andrew.
Bomb shelters.
Bomb shelters. Thomas?
God.
That's much better. My answer is going to be run to the site of the detonation and make sure you're gotten immediately and you don't get radiation poisoning.
Well, Thomas is the best among us.
No.
Yes. He gave the correct Sunday school answer. All right. Well, this has been our episode on Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, a hero? Yes. This has been the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew. We'll see you next time.